always think every Christmas is kind of like Easter and what you're going to preach, and because the story doesn't change, right? It's still the same story 2,000 years later. But I do want to kind of change it up, and we're going to do Unwrapping Christmas as our series for this month. I want to start with a question today, and did you ever stop to think about that? Why did God wait so long before He sent His Son? How many of you ever thought about that? Now, if you go back and look in the Bible, you'll find roughly 1,000 prophecies. Some put a little more, some put a little less, depending on how you interpret some of these verses. But about 1,000 prophecies in the Bible. A little over half of those, probably about 550 of those have been fulfilled already up to this point. The remaining prophecies deal with the second coming, the end time events that are going to take place. When you look at what's called Messianic prophecies, that which specifically talk about Jesus and Jesus coming, who Jesus is going to be, what He's going to do. There's 365 prophecies about Jesus, which have all been fulfilled to this point. Astronomical, as I've shared with you before, 1 in 10 trillion chance that even 8 of those things could be fulfilled in one person. 365 fulfilled. And then there's actually 44 Messianic prophecies in the Bible that speak directly to the birth of Jesus. He would be born of a virgin. He would be born in Bethlehem. Those type of things, again, all fulfilled in Jesus. So let me give you some of those. The actual first prophecy ever spoken about Messianic prophecy in the Bible, Jesus coming, is in Genesis chapter 3. Now, you know Genesis chapter 3, that this is a chapter, what happens? Adam and Eve sins. And when the fall of man takes place, the first Messianic prophecy is given. And God says, I will put enmity between you, talking about Satan, and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. You will strike at his heel, but he, talking about Jesus, will crush your head. Isaiah 7:14, the Lord gives you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and he will be called Emmanuel. Isaiah 9:6, for unto us a child is born, to us a son is given. He will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. And Micah chapter 5, verse 2, but you, Bethlehem, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come the one who will be ruler over Israel. But if you stop and think beyond the prophecies and begin to think about the timeline, if you go back and say, well, when was the earth created? Well, if you watch the Smithsonian Channel and listen to the scientists, then the earth was created roughly about 300,000 billion years ago, right? But if you go back and trace it through the genealogies in the Bible, you're going to find somewhere about 4,000 years before Jesus is born, roughly 4,000 to 6,500 years. Again, how you count, if all genealogies are in place. Most people put it roughly around the 4,000 year period. So we're talking about the fall of Adam and Eve and 4,000 years at least that follow where God does not fulfill the prophecies in which He's spoken. You need to think about that. So that first prophecy again is Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. And then the last prophecy that's spoken about Jesus coming is Micah, the one that we read here from chapter 5. And that happens 500 years before Jesus is born. So think about that. The first prophecy over 4,000 years before Jesus is born. The last prophecy about the birth of Jesus over 500 years before He's born. By the way, on a side note, at no extra cost this morning, is from the book of Malachi to the book of Matthew. There's 400 years of deadness, so to speak. There's no scriptures, no prophets listed for a 400-year period until we get to the book of Matthew. Why did God wait? What happened to the Jews during that 4,000 years? Not talking about just the rest of the world. What happened to the Jews? Well, if you go back and read the Bible in the Old Testament, you'll find that within that 4,000 year period that the Jews had to fight at least 81 battles. Now, the Bible is not a history of the battles fought. It's not the history of every event. It's the history of the story of the coming of God and the Messiah and man's relationship with God. So 81 specific battles are listed, so you know there had to be more battles that were fought. But the people went through 81 battles. The people went through 6 civil wars between their own people. They stayed in captivity a total of 670 years. Think about that. 200 years by the Assyrians, 400 years by the Egyptians, and 70 years by the Babylonians. 670 years of those 4,000 years, his people, his chosen nation, his chosen people were captives, were slaves and servants to foreigners who worshipped other gods. So when you look at the story, why didn't God send Jesus earlier? Why didn't he jump in the midst of that? And then we look at Israel itself and the Jewish people. You can go back and read in that 4,000-year period that the Bible specifically says that the people, the Jews, rebelled against God 384 times. How many of you said, wow, that's pretty amazing? 384 specific times it said, and the people rebelled against God. Why did he not send his son sooner? And then you're not even thinking about the rest of the world. Because it was God's plan for all the world to be saved. That was the whole point of the Messiah coming, right? The Messiah would come, the Jews would receive him as the Messiah, they would become his followers, and then they would take the gospel to the world. So what's happening with the rest of the world? The rest of the world is as lost as Hogan's goat, as the phrase goes. They are worshiping thousands and thousands of false gods and false idols, and they reject him as the one true God. Why did he wait? What was the magic of somewhere around the year 4 BC where God finally says, it's time? Now, one of the significance of answering that question is because there's another event to take place, right? And it's all about the same question of when God is going to say it's time. And that's the return of Jesus. So why has he waited 2,000 years for the return? Well, let me share with you 4 possibilities this morning, and they are simply possibilities. And so, again, no assurance, but just something to trigger your thought. And number 1 would be his predetermined timetable. We know that Ecclesiastes teaches us that God has a time for all things, right? There's a season for all things. There's a purpose under the sun, as Solomon writes. In Ecclesiastes, it says that God sets the time, and in his time, he makes all things beautiful. In his time. Peter says that God has a different perspective on time, and this is not a literal phrase, it's a figurative phrase, that a day to us is like 1,000 years to him, vice versa. And so if you take him literally, well, Christ came 4 days later. But that's not to be taken literally. Maybe the thrust that many people believe is found in Daniel chapter 9. Is considered to be messianic prophecies. It is definitely prophecy, and it gives us a predetermined time. Let me read the verse for you. It's Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 26, if you want to follow along. 77s, now that's 2 different words, so we're not talking about the number 77, 70 and then sevens, are decreed for you to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness and bring in eternal righteousness. Then the anointed one, the ruler, will come. But the problem is how we interpret the word 7. Not how we interpret 70. If the word 7 literally just means 7 days, or as many interpret it, it means 7 years. If it means 7 years, that you can actually take this prophecy when it's spoken, that would be 490 years, and it would line us up with the birth of Christ, almost to the day. And so maybe God did predetermine exactly the timetable and declared it 77s to take place. But again, there's quite a bit of division on what that word 7 literally means. Romans chapter 5, verse 6, Paul makes a point of saying this: at just the right time, when we were powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. And to the Galatians in chapter 4, he writes, when the set time had come, God sent his Son to redeem us. So is Paul saying there was a predetermined set time? Or is Paul simply saying at the time that God felt it was the right time, he sent his Son? Possibility. Number 2 is the rise of the Roman Empire. But before there's a rise of the Roman Empire, you go back 500 years before there was ever a Roman Empire. And how many of you have heard of the Persian Empire? The Persian Empire was even bigger than the Roman Empire. It covered more space, more land, and at the particular time, it had more of the world's population than did the world Roman ever had. In fact, you go back and look at the history of the Persian Empire, was around 550 BC. It lasted for 180 years, and actually 44% of the world at that time lived under Persian rule. That's amazing, isn't it? 50 million people estimated. It spanned 3 different continents, just like the Roman Empire did, but why did God not send Jesus during the Persian Empire, if that's the case? Then the Roman Empire comes around, like I said, about 400 years after, 500 years after the Persian Empire. It's going to last over 400 years. Some people say it lasted over 1,000 years. Again, how you kind of interpret all of these events. But during the height of the Roman Empire, it only consisted of about 25% of the world's population, which is still a big deal, right? 25% of the people in the world during that time, the same 3 continents, served under the Roman rule. But what makes the Roman Empire a possibility that God waited, that this was the right time, the right place to send, is the Romans were very much unlike the Persians. The Persians enforced and inflicted upon every country that they invaded their culture. They came and they placed upon every country in which they invaded their belief system. They expected the people to learn their language. They expected the people to follow their culture, to follow their laws, to worship their gods. The Romans had an opposite approach. The Romans were about dominance. They were about taxes. They weren't about culture. They weren't about religion. And so as the Romans began their empire, they allowed every nation to maintain its own culture. They allowed every nation to maintain their own identity, their own religion. So when you go back and you read the Christmas story, one of the people that you're going to hear about is King Herod, right? Well, why is there a King Herod when there's a Caesar? It's because Caesar allowed all of these countries to maintain, quote unquote, a king, even though they're puppets. But they still have a certain amount of power to administer over that particular country. Obviously, under the dominance, under the control of the Roman Empire, but it allowed the spread of commerce. It allowed the spread of new ideals and new religions and all of these different things to take place. In addition to that, the Greek culture was dominating the world. You know, there's so much that you and I practice today and are part of today that come out of the Greek and the Greek world and the Greek culture that still exists in our lives today. And so it became a more open field without question for Jesus to enter into this type of world. Jews freely traveled. There was Jews living in many of the countries. We see that in the day of Pentecost, don't we? That we know at least 27 different languages that were spoken by the different Jews that were there. So they were from that many different countries. And so it allowed that open door more so than the Persian Empire would have ever allowed for the gospel to be taken to the world. So the rise of the Roman Empire is definitely a possibility. Now these two are the two that you'll kind of hear and see more if you kind of Google this type of things. But the last two are more original to myself that I want to share with you today. Number 3 is the players that are needed to make it happen. I don't really like the word players, but you understand what I'm saying. There has to be a virgin. There has to be a virgin who's pledged to be married. They have to be Jews. They have to be followers of God. Devout, devoted followers of God. They got to be a couple that's willing to withstand the persecution of their own families. We talked about that in Sunday school this morning. That don't forget, Mary could have been put to death. She could literally have been stoned to death. This is not 2019 America. Girls didn't have babies outside of marriage. And particularly here's Joseph saying, this is not my child. I've not slept with her. And you would say, well, Dennis, I kind of get what you're saying, but that's kind of maybe stretching a little bit far. You're trying to tell me that in 4,000 years God couldn't find those people. And I want you to think about this, and again, it's just a thought. But how many of you understand God doesn't force us to do anything? So you got to keep in mind that God has to find the people that's going to be involved in the Christmas story that are going to voluntarily say yes. That's going to do exactly what He tells them to do and say yes. Now, you think about it. Who would you trust with your child? God is sending His Son into this world, and He's going to send Him into the world as a baby. He's not going to drop Him out as a full man and just pops up on earth. He's going to start just like every human life starts as a baby. He's going to have to be cradled and rocked and changed and fed and all these other things. No, not everyone can fit that bill. Could it literally have taken 4,000 years for those stars, so to speak, to align for the right people to come along? Very possible. Because I'm convinced of that. There's things that God wants to do today, and there's not people to do it. How many of you believe that? I think there's things God wants to do right here in Burlington, Alamance County, but He can't find the church. He can't find the people that will do it right, who will take it and do what He says to do, how He says to do it, and not take it, try to manipulate it, turn it, twist it, and fit it to their mold. See, Mary and Joseph didn't have that alternative, did they? They weren't told, okay, have this baby, we'll check back in with you in 30 years. So maybe it's the players. But the one that really draws my heart is the last one. And personally, I think this is part of the story. It's the hesitance and the reluctance of a father to send his son into a dirty, filthy world. Every person in this room knows that you and I would not send our child the way God sent His child into this world. Every one of us would say that we're people who love other people. But not a single one of us would give our child for the people of this world. Even if we knew that it would bring their atonement, even if we knew that it would provide a pathway for forgiveness, we would not do it. Remember, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God. In the beginning, Jesus is with the Father. They create the world together. They create Adam and Eve together. They watch Adam and Eve fall together. He hears the word his Father speaks of that messianic prophecy of what's going to have to be done to provide a permanent pathway of atonement, that the animal sacrifice system will be a temporary substitution, but it can't last. When would you send your son into the world? See, I don't want us this Christmas to minimize any part of this story. I don't think we can come in here and just say it's no big deal that Jesus would leave heaven to come to this earth. Because I'm here to tell you today, it's a big deal. It's the biggest deal that's ever taken place. God would send His Son, the Holy Son, into a dirty, unholy world. And then to live among the very thing that you created. Absolutely mind-boggling. So I think God has a hesitance. He had a reluctance that this was something that He knew He had to do. It was something that He promised to do. But I don't really want to do it, but I promised to do it. I've got to do it because it's my desire for all people to come to me. For me to be in relationship with every one of these. And the only way that's going to happen is I've got to send my son, but remember those other prophecies? He's going to be beaten. He's going to be scorned. He's going to be rejected. He's going to be mocked. He's going to be insulted. He's going to be struck. He's going to be crucified. He's going to be buried. single one of us in here. If we were God, we would not do that. How many of you would agree with me? I know if I was God, I wouldn't do it. Every one of you would be dead. And of course, I'd be dead too. And you say, well, Dennis, maybe you're right, maybe you're not. What do you base it on? I base it on one verse. It's found in Matthew chapter 27, verse 46. It's actually when Jesus Christ is hanging on the cross. When he's being crucified to fulfill, to provide that pathway for atonement for our sins. And Jesus cries out those words. Say it with me. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? You see how hard this was for the Father? People look at that verse and they say that verse means that at least for a moment God turned his back on Jesus. At least for a moment God couldn't look. God couldn't look at his own son hanging on the cross for the very people who have rejected him for over 4,000 years. Well, we can't answer the question why it took so long, but how many of you are thankful that we live in a time where it has happened? And we have that benefit to come this morning and know that love. And that's what I want us to get lost in. This Christmas season, we totally get lost in how loved we are. I came across this saying. I'll close with this morning. Christmas began in the heart of God, but it's only made complete when it reaches into the heart of man. You see, if you're here this morning and you don't know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, or you're not in that right relationship with God, Christmas is just a story. It's not a life-changing event, it's just a story. Pray with me. If you're here this morning and you say, I want it to be more than a story. I want it to be my story. I just feel this morning that maybe God is speaking to someone and things need to be made right with God this morning. Maybe it's the first time of coming to Christ. Maybe it's something that you've prayed before, done before, but you've wandered away. You've sidetracked your life. And today you're not walking in fellowship with Christ, and you just need to make that commitment. I'm just going to ask you very simply, if God is speaking to your heart, just to raise your hand this morning. I'm going to ask you to come forward. Anything else? Anybody else this morning? God, don't allow us to miss Christmas. And I don't know how you would fulfill what I just prayed, because that's our choice to make. It's crazy to look back in the scriptures and find that in the midst of all this time with these Jews that have craved the Messiah so much, where they should have been pleading and begging for you to send your son on into the world, that instead we find 384 times they rebelled against you. They turned away from you. Many of those times they turned away from you and they worshiped idols, worshiped other gods. So today, Lord, we want this to be a season of love.